Whoops. Let's see if that works. Right, so I think we're live. I had tried to set this up to go into LinkedIn too, but LinkedIn is being pissy. LinkedIn doesn't want to have me on yet. That will change. So I'm Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What, which is always the question. Sustainability has no meaning as a word unless you're saying sustain what? Like how hot for climate? How many people for the planet? How safe from pandemics? And that's the whole idea of this initiative I'm doing here at Columbia University, which is on communication and sustainability. How do you make information matter? You know, we've been buffeted the last few weeks with, you know, masses of information and misinformation and speculation and provocation. And what we're going to use this hour or so is to step back a little bit. And I can't imagine better people to do that with than you guys, you who are joining us as viewers and commenters. Post your comments and questions. And Meehan Crist, who is the writer in residence for the Department of Biological Sciences at Columbia. And Jeff Schlegelmilch. How do you pronounce it best?
Schlegelmilch. So you're
Schlegelmilch. Oh, that's actually easier to say. To say. Schlegelmilch.
Yep.
Who is the deputy director of the National Center for Disaster Preparedness, and that kind of sounds, technical. And he is a master of the technical questions around disaster risk reduction, but he's also a really good communicator around, and a really good sort of, he posted this thing I just got to show everybody the other day, which I thought was priceless, especially given how we've been buffeted so hard with stuff. And I actually opened a show the other day by reading this, and I could do it again, or Jeff, if you can see it well, you could do it, because it was, or you could just say what you were saying.
Sure.
So Jeff, just kind of lead us through you posted this on Facebook, I think, initially to friends and the like.
Yeah. So, and I'm happy to read through it. And initially, it was really, just some advice based on a lot of the questions, and a lot of friends and family were just really, like a lot of folks, struggling to keep up with the influx of information. And I've actually observed over the years, whether it's in agencies or emergency operations centers, sort of very similarly, that, when we're dealing with uncertainty, rather than pivot ourselves to manage within uncertainty, we try and cram more and more information into our brains. We start picking up all this information, trying to connect the dots, but the information is really more noise. So my advice as a public service announcement, I don't know if I have the authority to issue a public service announcement, but I did, was a quick word of advice to folks out there struggling to keep up with all the latest COVID-19 info. Don't try and keep up with it all. There's a lot of real-time raw information coming out constantly, for example, promising results from one isolated clinical trial, etc. This fire hose of information is not actionable and may even be dangerous. If it becomes worth listening to, the CDC and local officials will update their guidelines. Take some time daily to review the latest information from official sources, the CDC, state and local health departments, government officials, who will update on the latest of what the science tells us. That should be more than enough to keep you updated. We're dealing with a tremendous amount of uncertainty. Adding more noise won't add to anything but your anxiety. Use your best judgment with the information available, and for the space in between, find ways to relax, recharge, and if you're able, to help others who may be in need. So,
pretty darn good. And us news people, we're pretty bad at that. Especially in this internet age. I remember the New York Times. I do remember still when we'd file a story and then you'd go home and you were done. And then if it was a page one story, this copy editor, who was the special guy for the bigger stories, would call you around supper time. And my wife got pretty familiar with that rhythm when I was doing stuff that made the front page. But now it's a completely different thing. Actually, in the New York Times building, you would hear the presses starting to run. That was the last year that happened, was the first year I was at the New York Times. Then they moved out to New Jersey and Queens and stuff. And that rhythm just went away. And now my poor friends in the news business today, as you all experience hour by hour on your devices, are in nonstop mode. And this leads to some problems. You see, just think about the studies that have emerged the last few weeks that point to a promising thing about chloroquine, and then President Trump takes it and runs with it and makes it into this, that we've done. It's all done. We're going to all be safe by Easter. And Meehan, you're a writer, and maybe not so much in that kind of daily grind mode, but how have you dealt with this as a consumer of news and also as a writer? Maybe you could talk a little bit about both.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are actually linked for me. Maybe because I'm a writer, the way that I deal with overwhelming, particularly social public circumstances, is to write about them. So, of course, this all happened, and the first thing I did was agree to write a piece for the New York Times, which I think should be appearing online sometime today. Actually, I filed it like 2 hours ago. So for me, it actually was sort of helpful because I was writing about coronavirus, and particularly how all of this may or may not affect climate. And so it actually created a kind of a lens through which to filter all of the information. I was sort of like, I don't have time to read that. I have to find the climate stuff. I don't recommend this. I don't think it's a particularly healthy way to deal with the overflow of information, but it was just the way that I sort of managed things this week, was by looking sort of, Jeff, as you suggested, at sort of like the top headlines of things. And I want to see what's happening, CDC, WHO, headlines of the New York Times and Guardian, that kind of thing. But I was trying not to go much deeper and get lost in the weeds, partly because I had created a situation for myself where I didn't have time to.
Yep.
So, that was kind of it, like trying to figure out how to filter the noise. I also do a thing with varying success and various, days and weeks of my life where I don't let myself look at the news before 12 noon. I sort of feel like anything that happens during the day, I don't actually need to know about it at like 8:30 a.m. I don't actually need to know about it at 9 a.m. Like, the world is not going to end if I don't know what Trump said 15 minutes ago. And I find that sometimes, in fact, my world crumbles if I know what Trump said 15 minutes ago. And so sort of choosing to titrate the news in such a way that I'm choosing when I look at it, and I sort of know I'm going to get bowled over. And I'm like, all right, it's lunchtime. I've been bowled over. I have to pull myself back together and do whatever I'm doing this afternoon. And then I try and look again in the evening. But I really try not to sort of constantly check in and refresh, except for the things that I'm working on, right? So I was sort of constantly looking at the climate related news. But again, that's just particular to me.
We can circle back to that in a few minutes, perhaps. And by the way, maybe each of you, before we get to Lisa, can just talk a bit about your home life and how this plays out there too. Meehan, I think you have one or more than one kid.
I have one kid. Yep. And he is in this sort of tiny drunken monkey phase of childhood.
Aren't we all?
Yeah, right. He's fine.
Yeah.
Oh, that's my phone. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay.
I called the wrong phone.
That's pardon me.
But that's all part of the information overload.
So I have a friend on Twitter who posted, it finally happened, an audible toilet flush on a conference call.
Oh.
So that's the low bar for everyone. So
Right. Sorry about that.
Someone forgot to mute.
Yeah. So clearly I'm handling my daily life fine. Everything's fine. It's hard because my partner and I are both writers and we both teach. And so we're both, learning to teach online and also juggling the needs of, the scientists and the other people that we work with, as well as having deadlines. He just had a piece that went up at Slate, which was also about coronavirus and sort of armchair epidemiology and why that's a problem, which relates again, Jeff, to what your piece was about. So between deadlines, teaching, and taking care of a baby, it's a scramble. It's, I'm sort of in the camp of people that are going to like throw my phone at the wall if I see another post about how someone's learning a new language or learning to play the banjo or whatever. I'm just like, I am not sleeping and barely getting by, and I'm really, really glad you just got a banjo.
I might have to play my banjo. So, and Jeff, at home for you, what's it like? And then Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very, very fortunate, to have just my daughter's in 8th grade, adjusting pretty well to the remote learning and stuff. But really, my wife is absolutely incredible in terms of helping to create and preserve a structure and make sure there's that downtime and make sure there's that. I don't know what all I'm doing other than popping down once in a while to say hello, but I'm very fortunate to be surrounded by really wonderful people at work and at home who kind of are putting those structures in place for doing that. So it's certainly, but along the same lines too, it's like, I find, so in a lot of the information management work that I've done in the past, rather than try and look forward at what might I need to know, is look backwards from, what information is actually going to impact my decisions or the actions that I have to take in response to COVID-19. So the information I consume kind of similarly, a lot of times I have to keep up with things just enough so that I know the questions I'm going to get from folks who have similarly read the journal article now that there's no paywall, and to contextualize it. But the reality is, in a lot of folks that I talk to and is that, these contamination of surfaces, how long does COVID exist on the surfaces? Well, if you're working with aircraft that are down for 48 hours, it of course matters to you if it lives for a few hours on surfaces or 17 days. But are you as a person going to not wash your hands, or you weren't going to wash your hands when it was only 9 hours, but now it's 17, right? There's a certain threshold where it matters and the guidance actually changes. And for most people, it doesn't. But and so sort of trying to throttle between my professional life, what information do I need to have answers to versus what is it really for the home life and what's actually going to change the way we're living our life is actually what I don't need a constant refresh rate for that. The daily check-ins, I actually try to simulate the old days of the morning paper, right? Where you're reading the morning paper and getting your update from yesterday's news and things, which, so it's, but I also recognize that, I'm fortunate to be surrounded by people and in a circumstance where it may be somewhat easier for me to adjust than for a lot of other folks. And so I certainly try not to take that for granted.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Lisa Bennett-Matkin, Garrison, New York.
How are you guys?
You have a pretty special perspective on this because you're one of the tens of thousands of people around the world who has had COVID-19 now. I'm sure it came as a. Could you just explain a little bit about how the awareness grew and how you dealt with it with your kids and where you're going from here? Lisa's a yoga instructor, marvelous beacon in the community of wholeness and of calm. So here you go.
Thank you. Well, nice to be on the show. Thank you so much. Wow. Yeah, no, it really took us by surprise. My daughter came down with a fever and some of the symptoms, and I was like, okay, here we go. Called the doctor and they're like, oh, well, let's just see how it is. If she has a fever tomorrow, we'll check in. And and I just was like, no, we're going to get this. We're going to figure out how to get you tested right away just because I want to know, because I want to know if I'm coming in contact with anyone. And
Sure.
So we took her to Northern Westchester emergency room. And it was before the criteria changed. And she was able to get tested. And so then 2 days later, my son and I both came down with the same symptoms. And so we were like, no. And she woke up and she's like, I feel like I got hit by a truck. And then I was like, oh, taking care of her as best I can with just holding balance and holding distance. And then, I would say, I think it's very difficult to, if you have a small person, I mean, she's not a small person, right? She's 8 actually, but they're just, I don't know. I mean, I just don't know that they're as conscious teenagers about what they're touching and how their surfaces and cleaning and keeping the bathroom separate from everybody. It was tricky. So we ended up all getting it. And so it's uncomfortable. It's painful. It wipes you out. You really can't, I couldn't do very much. The good news is you lose your appetite, your sense of smell. So I didn't really have to feed us that much. It was beverages, and if I could pull off cooking something, it was just couldn't clean up the kitchen afterward. And that was, it just is what it was. And it was just really a lot of rest. And, honestly, what really helped me a lot I believe, honestly, is my practice of what they call pranayama, which is breath work. So I do a lot of breath practice. And so I made sure the kids were doing that. I did that. I do some meditation. And somehow I've always found that meditation helps with pain management. And this particular condition is extremely painful. I've had fevers and flus in the past. The level of ache on this one is ruthless. I mean, it's pretty ferocious. So that wasn't fun, but we're definitely on the other side. I mean, every day the fever kind of goes up and down, up and down, up and down, 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 down. And then just maybe it lingers. It shows up about once a day for a couple hours. You kind of get knocked out really early, but that's been our perspective on it. and
how long a window was that from the time your daughter got sick and to now?
It's about a week. Just a week for her. We're like about, Ian and I are about a day ahead of her, day and a half, something like that. So Ian's 15, Tati's 18. So this is, not something that young people don't get. And I wanted to make sure that they all knew that, because I really feel like, that was kind of like, oh my God, this is so dumb. We've got great immune systems. We can't we can't get it. And it was like, no, you don't understand. You can get it. And you can pass it. And it's just, if you pass it to somebody's grandfather or someone's got an immune condition, we've got problems. You really need to take responsibility for this. So.
And so how long have you been told how long you have to, now do you know if your immunity now is such that you can be out in the world afterwards? And there's been this discussion, I think, underway. Jeff probably knows more about the science of this.
I would love to know for sure. You keep hearing like, you can't go out for a month after you get, the Department of Health called and they were like, March 31st was Tati's date. So, I'll take 2 extra days to be completely quarantined. And, but, I'm like, okay, so do we fumigate the house? The car,
Sure.
Right. I really would be very interested in hearing your take on it, what the most up-to-date, accurate information on this, and do we have immunity? I would like to know, because if I do, then I feel like I could be really helpful in the world too. Right. If I grow up, right, and I can't get it again, that would be wonderful.
So Jeff, you're not a doctor, but what's the general lay of the land there these days in terms of, well, let's say the 2 things, contact tracing and all that stuff. And then, once people are safe, do they get to wear a little green lapel pin?
Yeah. I mean, you certainly can. So, but and actually, Lisa, I'm very glad to hear that you and your family are doing well on the tail end of all this as well, too. Obviously, it must have been a very, very scary time to go through and still probably very unnerving. So I'm very glad to hear that. Yeah. So there's a lot that's not known. And so I think, and I'm speaking as not a researcher at the cutting edge of this or a clinician, I'll be a little cagey in the responses, but I would think that, in terms of surfaces and things like that, wiping down with, the Clorox wipes, the bleach-based wipes, things that you would normally use if you had the flu in the house, it seems to be susceptible to, common disinfectants and things like that. There's more specific guidance, but basically, as, I was taught when I was an epidemiologist, is typically, bleach is good, more bleach is better. And if it's wet and it's not yours, don't touch it. That's kind of the 2 main rules that everything else stems from. But
yours, don't touch it. I like that.
Yeah. Along those lines as well, too, it sounds like the guidance from the Department of Health is fairly similar, that when you're sick with it, you're shedding more of the virus, and so at a higher risk to others. There are concerns about asymptomatic carriers, people with no symptoms who may be shedding virus, which is definitely a concern. The degree to which that isn't fully known, but as you fight it off, it's obviously less and less of a risk. The immunity is a bit of an open question. So the CDC is in the process of fielding these serology tests, which would actually look for the immune response to people to actually better identify, are there these asymptomatic carriers, and have you built up an immunity to this? The other big question is how often the virus mutates. So using flu or even other coronaviruses, they evolve naturally. They sort of, the replication process is very, very messy. So it just mutates a lot in the evolution process. A lot of RNA viruses are like that. So it's similar to why we need a new flu shot every year, right? Because in the wild, but your body kind of recognizes it, right? It's able to fight it off. It's when it jumps species and is completely new that it's that more severe response that we're seeing. But circling back to a more direct question on, people probably have some degree of immunity to it after being sick to it. Is it total? And if so, for how long? These are questions that aren't fully answered yet, or even all that partially answered. The most likely situation is you probably do have some degree of immunity to it. And for certainly a short period of time, it probably is at a fairly high level. There was even talk about potentially deploying healthcare workers, right, who have had it back into the field. I don't know where that's at in terms of, taking that theory into practice. But the likely scenarios, there's probably some degree of immunity. How long it lasts is a bit of an, and how much is still a bit of an open question, which hopefully in the next few months, as those serology tests are developed and fielded, you get kind of more information around all of that. So not a very precise answer. Maybe someone out there in the ether is tracking this more closely, is a little closer to an answer, but hopefully that helps a little.
Yeah, and I think you've nailed though something here that's hard for everybody. A couple of years ago, maybe it was 3 years ago, I did a workshop in Costa Rica for Latin American journalists on covering emerging disease. And really, it was a workshop on covering uncertainty, because it was Zika at the time was the case study. And here was this incredibly scary health phenomenon, new, weird, with this devastating potential impact, in microcephaly babies. There's just nothing more unnerving than that. So, and yet the questions outnumbered the answers. So as a journalist or as a communicator, a professional communicator, it leads to all these, this tendency, or the stress factor is huge. And how do you write about something with that level of uncertainty? And here we are again, Meehan, you deal with this in the context of writing. So what does that feel like sometimes?
Well, yeah, I mean, I write a lot about climate change, and so a lot of this is very familiar. And I think that there are, similar sort of lessons to be taken from the way that we communicate about climate change and the way that disinformation and misinformation sort of travels around that particular subject. And I think the way that I handle it is by focusing on what we do know, because we actually know a tremendous amount. And in terms of climate, there is, a vast and very robust consensus about what we do know, which is that, it's going to get really, really bad, and it's our fault. And there are things we can do to make it better. And that the effects are going to be unevenly distributed and are going to hit the vulnerable communities harder and hardest. And all of those things hold true for this virus. And I think that we can say those things. There are things about how it spreads, how quickly it spreads, the relationship between what we do and how severe the outbreak is. We know some of these things enough to act. And similarly with climate, we're seeing some of the same kinds of denialism and same patterns of denialism coming up around uncertainty, right? Which is with climate, it's, we don't quite know enough. And so we can't do these things that might harm the economy. And with COVID and with this pandemic, it's also sort of creepily in the last even couple days, the conservative rhetoric has shifted in particular to, well, it's really uncertain. We can't take these big measures because it's going to hurt the economy. Right. And I think it's worth saying that, the economy is not some monolith that's completely separate from human beings, right? What happens in the economy also affects our daily lives. And so, yes, we do want a functioning economy, and we want workers to be protected. We want workers to have work, and we want, goods to be flowing in some kind of way that functions for society. But being so fearful of somehow breaking what it is we have, as if what we have is so fantastic anyway, because for many of us, it is not. That fear is, I worry that fear is going to cause a lot of slowdown around things that could happen. And we're kind of already seeing that. This is a very, very long answer to the uncertainty question, which is it can be used for political purposes, but I think there is a lot of foundational science there that is what we should be paying attention to, rather than how much it is we necessarily don't know.
There is this other aspect to this too that makes it hard, which is when you think about protecting public health, protecting individual health and public health, and as you were saying, that broader sweep of how our welfare is linked to the economy. If the economy crashes, people are out of work, who don't have insurance, they don't go to the hospital, they die too. And it gets into these value judgments that I think create challenges as well. I just had this bit of a debate on Twitter. I'm showing it here with a guy from the Cato Institute, which is very much a limited government libertarian organization. And he was defending some aspects of the government not being the determining factor in how we make those decisions, which I find very troubling about protecting public health. And I did say, but I did agree with him in the end. Like, I've been tracking the hospital bed question. How many hospital beds should we have per 1,000 people? And there is this nice database on that stuff. Here's hospital beds per 1,000 people, and the U.S. is about 2.8, and Japan is 12.8 per 1,000 people. And the question of what's the right number of hospital beds per 1,000 people is somewhere probably in the middle. And it all depends on how much you're investing for that big bad thing versus how much you're investing for general capacity versus a lot of questions. And it gets into this murky stuff that, to me, I guess the value there is that once he and I were back and forth a little while on Twitter, we kind of found some things to agree on. We weren't just battling each other, to the death. You're right, you're wrong. And in recognizing these value questions seems to be part of where we have to figure out. I don't know. Jeff, I'm sure you deal with that a lot too, because policy can be complicated. I don't know if you've been dug in on that.
Yeah, so it's actually, uncertainty is one of those things that is really at the center of everything with disasters, right? And because it crosses so many different sectors, it's inherently chaotic, the data. You have all these different influences. Politics influences a lot of things, whether it should or shouldn't, it does. Psychology, sociology, biology, they're all at play here today. Economics, and a lot of times, essentially, I mean, you've all spoken about it, we're dealing with uncertainty, but we don't really have a vocabulary for uncertainty, where we want precise answers, and so we drive ourselves towards that. But there are actually some mechanisms for managing uncertainty. This is something that I've written about and have some things coming out where I talk a lot about how do we transition from trying to force certainty on uncertain situations and actually move towards managing uncertainty. And so there are different mechanisms for, so for example, there's this book by Michael Raynor called The Strategy Paradox, and it's focused on the business environment, but essentially looks at, how do you make commitments when the information you need to make that commitment is farther down the timeline than you need to make the commitment. He starts off the book with the example of VHS and Betamax, which is a safer bet, right? And how at the time, Betamax was just as safe of a bet than VHS, and essentially goes through processes of, instead of forcing commitments prematurely, is creating options. So instead of, going down one path, creating a series of options that you can exercise down the road. And so we spend some time applying that to emergency management. The military also has some ways through their synchronization matrices. So if you have a hurricane coming, you don't know if you're going to need to evacuate, but at what point is the last point you can make that decision to evacuate. Based on the time it takes to get out of there, it's usually 24 or 12 hours before tropical storm force winds. So what you do is you set up these decision points, and then you set up your information requirements for making that decision. And that comes from the threat information as well as some of the political information and things like that. So there's different techniques out there that can be applied to these situations. But what it does is it requires pivoting from sort of trying to, again, impose certainty on an inherently chaotic environment, and instead using a different set of tools that are designed for managing within uncertainty, to create options and to create processes that can adapt as more information becomes available.
So how does some of that distill down to the household?
Well, and actually, I was actually going to ask as well, too, because Lisa, I know you come from a perspective of both individually going through that uncertainty, as well as having your studio and as a business owner with all of that, because I think that we've done it with Emergency Operations Center and things like that. But I'm curious more kind of your thoughts on all of this. I know you mentioned the breathing practices and things like that, sort of having things like that to be able to help get through. But I don't know if you have. I certainly don't have the answer.
No, I don't have the answer either, but I was thinking as you were saying all of that, I was like, wow, I just, would come from such an opposite. It's just, wherever your strength is, right? I think we're just going to draw from whatever our strengths are, right? And so, it was interesting as you were speaking about, I was thinking about the animals, and I was thinking about how they all kind of know a tsunami's coming, right? Or they know how to react because of their connectedness to nature. Really, they're connected. They're deeply intuitive. I mean, maybe you guys could break it down, the scientists, and figure out exactly what they're doing intellectually, but it's to me in their gut. And so really, I work from a much more intuitive place, and I feel like that's my strength, is the years of spiritual work, whatever that is for you, whether you call that creativity, whether you call that intuitiveness, whether you call it your intuition, whatever that is. So, but that needs to be cultivated on a daily basis, right? We have to have a practice of quieting the mind, using the breath, tapping into whatever it is that you call something bigger than the intellect, the rational mind, and get that chatter and that busyness and that, because the interesting thing to me is I've taught some of the smartest people on the planet, and I'm always like, I don't know what I got to give you, but if you can turn it off, I think I have something for you. Can you quiet it just for a minute? And it's always like, that's the challenge, can we just hold that space? Because in that space, there's a wisdom that's nothing that you can think, it's something that comes to you. And in that place, that's where I feel safe. I don't know how to explain it other than being really, really present in the moment. And then it's, one breath at a time, one step at a time. And then the next right action is revealed. Yeah. I don't know if that's helpful to everybody else, but it certainly gets me through a lot of challenges. So it's a different approach.
It reminds me of a colleague of mine, Daniel Aldrich. He wrote a book on the 3/11 disasters in Japan, the tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear meltdown. Not in that order, but the and how the protocol that was imposed was that if there was a tsunami, you don't stop to help other people. You get up to the top of the hill because that's going to save the most lives. And the whole first part of the book is these individual stories of people who basically ignored that their values did not allow them to do that. And they ended up saving many, many lives, particularly the elderly and the more vulnerable, by tapping in to that instinct rather than that protocol that was more theorized. So I think that there's absolutely something to be said that, some parts of our life are very ordered and other parts require softer edges. But I very much respect and appreciate kind of that perspective on things. I think it's something we need more of in the work that we do in my field.
What was the name of the book?
Black Wave.
I just found it. I'll tweet it later.
Yeah.
That sounds pretty extraordinary. Yeah. So many things come to mind in this discussion. And the one that I was going to ask about fled my mind because the book sounded so interesting. Meehan, what brought you into writing about what you write about? And as opposed to all the other things.
Yeah, as opposed to everything else in the world.
Right.
I'll try to do a very short story of this. I was working on a piece about traumatic brain injury, and I wanted to understand what happened in the brain. I had no background in science training, so while I was getting an MFA in creative nonfiction, I decided I would real quick learn some neuroscience, which led me to actually doing a bunch of interviews with veterans and people who were coming back, particularly from Iraq and Afghanistan, and who were experiencing traumatic brain injuries or had known people who'd experienced them. And talking to a lot of them, a lot of these guys and a lot of women also were particularly attuned to the ways that militarism was connected to degradation of the climate. And so as I was trying to understand about neuroscience, I sort of took this left turn into thinking about climate, because it was also sort of a large, complex system that we don't entirely understand and that has a lot of uncertainty to it, and that seems to matter deeply. This was, I don't know, a decade ago maybe. And I just sort of kept going. But to go back very quickly, Lisa, to your comment, I wanted to also echo that I think that the finding the quiet, particularly in the midst of the noise, this conversation is sort of about how do you just manage every day with all of the influx of news and information that's sort of washing over you. Not listening is a really important thing to do, I think, so that you can find a way to listen to whatever it is that you particularly need to be paying attention to. And I think particularly in these moments where there's the anxiety creates a desire to have someone tell you what to do, right? And so part of the parsing through all the news and looking through all the feeds is like, someone will tell me somewhere exactly what it is I'm supposed to be doing and what I'm supposed to be thinking or what I'm supposed to be feeling, how to best prepare, how to protect my family, whatever those things are. And sometimes you can get lost in that, and the things that you might need to do are things that it's information that's not out there, right? It might be information that's actually in your living room because your kid is telling you what they need, or your partner is telling you what they need. And interestingly, the animal example, I think some science is beginning to show that, at least I think with earthquakes, that animals are actually able to feel the vibrations earlier, that like it's not necessarily an intuitive sense. There is actually a physiological ability that animals have to experience things before we experience them. But that is real information, right? And it's information that they're getting through the ways that they are particularly attuned to the physical world. And so thinking about the ways that you are particularly attuned to your physical world might offer some kind of compass in this noise.
And what this brings to mind is the work of Susie Moser, who was at Columbia for our managed retreat conference this past summer, which was on examining how to normalize that in a changing climate with rising sea levels. The world has to get used to the idea that there's no new normal when you live on a coast. That even with successful emissions reductions, we're going to end up with centuries of sea level rise. It's just already in the system. And Susie, I've known for more than 20 years. She's worked in climate resilience and adaptation, and she has been pursuing, I think she has some NSF funding now for this project she sees around the need to facilitate and foster to build what she calls the adaptive mind. And this is what are the capacities in practitioners particularly, but in communities all around the world that can give that adaptive quality, so that you maybe are a little bit more like the people Jeff described, who have a slightly more communitarian approach to fleeing a tsunami or the like. It's an amazingly important project. I was hoping to get her to Columbia this spring before, all the shit happened. And, but there's it feels like one of the things that's so needed, especially, we're as you just search for the age of pandemics. This is not the first. This is not the last of what we're seeing now. And of course, with climate change, remember, no new normal sea level rise, no new normal sea level, no new normal climate for generations forward. And I don't know how much this has come into your thinking, Jeff. I've been talking to people at the School of Social Work at Columbia who are very interested now in getting into the climate space a little more too. And I'm sure now with what's happening with COVID-19, all that has done is sort of widen the boundaries of what we need to think about in terms of the needs, the capacities, in people or in communities that we really need to foster if we want to have a smoother ride.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And it's something that actually our center and we think about quite a bit. I actually, the timing is a little eerie, but I have a book coming out this summer called Rethinking Readiness, A Brief Guide to 21st Century Mega Disasters. And what we talk about in that book is really ways where human activity is contributing both to the underlying threat as well as the underlying vulnerability. So climate change is an example where we're contributing to carbon emissions, but at the same time, we're building in vulnerable areas. What's particularly eerie is the first chapter, we go through 5 scenarios, and the first scenario, I say we because I've interviewed a lot of folks in it and things like that along the way. And actually the original idea came from my director, Erwin Redlener. But the first scenario is pandemics. And I was reading the proofs last week and reading through all the things that were said. And it's eerie that everything that's playing out now is exactly sort of as laid out by the research and the experts. I had the privilege of speaking with everything from it emerging from close human interaction with animal environments, the emergence at the Wuhan live animal and seafood market, to the lack of early detection and the weaknesses in those detection systems, to the traffic and the ability to spread and the difficulty, and it's just across the board. But I think it really speaks to that, really what we're looking at, these challenges are not going to be accomplished by creating the perfect checklist. We're not going to overcome these challenges by creating the world's greatest checklist. We're going to overcome it by having both in this generation more adaptive systems that are more that are rooted in science, but also go beyond that to recognize that different values and different cultures need to be a part of the conversation here as well too, and most importantly, to really make sure that we're investing in the next generation, that we're providing them with the tools to deal with more complex challenges that cross more sectors. And in addition to kind of the traditional sort of siloed deep science approach, is to also find ways to value more overtly the cross-sector expertise, so folks can navigate and manage uncertainty, and bring that into the way that we think about things and approach these disasters. Just one other quick point is that we often look to science. We sort of started this way, is we look to science for answers to questions that don't necessarily have answers that science can answer. Let me see if I can say that a little differently. Right? It's like we can tell you, the cost of. I think in public health all the time, New York City tried to ban the extra large sodas, and I have a lot of trouble reconciling that, because on the one hand, I know if there's a soda in the fridge and I don't even want one, I'm probably going to drink it, because for some reason in my brain, it is less taxing on me to open a can of soda than to pour a cup of water and refill the Brita. I don't know, I'm wired wrong, but that's who I am. So I know you were doing me the biggest favor in the world by allowing me to not have access to that. At the same time, isn't it my God-given right to drink 96 ounces of Mountain Dew if I so right? And it's so what I can't reconcile, but I do think that that's what's really important, is that science can talk about the costs, but and the benefits, but it can't give the value. That value comes from a greater collectivism, and that's really where elected officials are so important in a democracy, because they're the ones who have to parse that. The science will take you so far, and then at some point a decision has to be made, and that has to be heavily informed by the science, but science is not the exclusive arbiter of these complex decisions. So
so Lisa, mindfulness and yoga are not like the same thing, but they both they intersect. They're very much intersecting Venn diagram circles, and that mindful sort of attention to the world around you, empathy, the general concepts of what's called mindfulness. Dan Siegel, who I've become friends with over the years at UCLA, he's a psychiatrist who talks about how we have he thinks of the mind as not just being in your brain. He says your mind is very much in the community, and that we have as he calls it, a we map and a me map. And the me map, of course, is like you and your family. Are we safe? And the we map is this much bigger construct, and he sees great value. And we just had a meeting recently right here in Garrison at on planetary health at the Garrison Institute, and we talk all the time about, here we are living on the internet. We're talking to each other. I think there's more than just information flowing between us, among us. I think the last week I had one of these with a poet, a comedian, and a storyteller, and we wanted to hug each other through the screen at the end. So there, I think there is something that can happen on this thing called the internet that can boost some of those capacities we talk about in the mind, even in Susie Moser's adaptive mind. Part of that seems to be the bigness of your mind. And I don't know whether that feels, either through your direct experience with having had this disease recently, or just your general practice, whether you felt that off and on or not. I mean, very much your practice is all about being in the room with someone. As Lisa, my wife, says, you're really good at the hands-on part of yoga, adjusting people, and you can't do that through a screen. So are we like in a good place potentially here with the internet when we think about all this? Each of you, Meehan as a storyteller, Jeff as a disaster risk maven, and you as a practitioner of wellness. Is this a good or bad moment in the sense of us being pulled more into the digital space?
I think you're aware that I work with the Native elders. I was up in Colombia with these unbelievably wise, amazing people, elders from 4 different tribes, and they're kind of coming out of their isolation to kind of say, hey, everybody, we need to wake up because we're having, the earth is really having some trouble here. And, if we can talk about a we, and the idea that these Native elders are now making use of cell phones to then put their teachings out into the world and share. And the most amazing thing is that what they're sharing is very similar to what I've learned in yoga. And so it's this very interesting message of, to me, crisis equals opportunity. I mean, right? There's this moment where we have an opportunity to either drop into our fear or drop into elevating ourselves and creating a change, creating a new evolution like this. I remember there's a beautiful story about a seed in the earth, and the earth is pressing down upon it and it's cracking open and the seed's like, I'm dying. And then, and basically the seed is being cracked open to put the roots down and to grow into a flower. And I feel like that's what's happening to us. We're going to make use of all of these different things that we have available to us and rise up and be more than we were before. Right? Access new abilities that we have, being more generous. Every single thing that we can access and turn the knob up on, whether it's our faith, whether it's our dedication to our health, whether it's our generosity, whether it's our love and compassion, whether it's breaking down any prejudice, whether it's getting over whatever was in the way of our growth is now shifting. And it's this opportunity, this great moment of huge potential. So I see it as the elders would say, this is kind of negativity in service to positivity, something difficult that helps all of us to grow and evolve.
I would say I think this actually ties into a little bit with what Jeff was just talking about, where science can only take us so far, and then at some point we have to look at, we have structures set up, we have political structures, and we have leaders who are elected, and I think that this is a really important time to reevaluate the social contract. When there is a disaster, what do we expect of our government, and what kind of a society do we want to build, and how do we want to work to protect each other, not just on the level of individuals and how we individually interact, whether it's in person or on the internet, but what is the contract that we have between individuals and our governing structures. And I think right now there's a lot of uncertainty around that. And I think that there's a spectacular amount of room for improvement.
I think so too. On so many levels. There are a couple of questions that have come in. Jesse Henshaw, who I've known for a long time virtually, I'm pretty sure Jesse used to post on .earth, my blog at the New York Times, says, aren't there numerous somewhat slower, unconstrained exponentials causing crises to also attend to? Gosh, two different sessions on this Sustain What webcast I've done just in the last few days were on those bigger levels of, and I guess this gets at that issue of what level do you work on an issue like this? Think of the coronavirus, this coronavirus, which was jumped from an animal to a human in Wuhan, China, sometime in mid-November, and has absolutely exploded like a biological tsunami around the world. And so do you work on which part of the system do you work on? And of course, I think you would all agree the answer is every part. Yeah. And that's also been one of my learnings on climate. I wrote a piece in 2016 assessing 30 years of writing about climate change. Like, what did I actually learn? And I came away concluding that the climate problem really isn't a solvable problem in the traditional context of problems. And I think that even the pandemic has the same complexity, right? You don't fix this. The sheltering in place is a temporary phenomenon to slow it, and a vaccine can fix this one, but doesn't fix the system, right? So where do you choose to work? And with climate change, carbon price doesn't do anything on its own. Again, we have rising sea levels for centuries to come. So you need adaptation too. So the more you do that, the more you iterate, you realize, oh my God, it's essentially every problem. And that leads me back to what can we do to boost the capacity of communities and individuals, whether it's through voting or through some engineer doing a new cool widget for batteries, or a teacher incorporating sustainability concepts into a curriculum, or it's kind of like the prismatic nature of the problem is awful. That's the paralytic giant part, but it also means every single person has something to do. And that, I think, with intentionality, with some motivation, that's kind of what you want to foster. But then what do you invest in? Where does that $2 trillion go? How much of that goes into basic education for science? How much of it goes into building stuff that's essentially building back the systems we already had? Those are such important questions. Now, for each of you, we're kind of getting toward dinner hour. And me, and I know with your kid, I showed a picture a minute ago, Patrick Keyes on another one of these a couple of days ago, had his boy in his arms while we were talking. So if each of you could think about, when you think of that prismatic, multidimensional nature of pandemics, of the climate change, of the issues of the Anthropocene, and then you take a breath, maybe 2 breaths. What comes to mind as a path?
Well, for me, I think that none of the individual changes that we can make in our individual lives matter if there is not also really vast structural change. I don't think, for example, that reducing your individual carbon footprint, which was, by the way, an idea that was popularized by BP in a 2005 ad campaign to sort of deflect attention away from the company and onto the individual. I don't think that those kind of individual actions are meaningless, but I also don't think that they matter and are not going to matter in terms of avoiding the worst climate outcomes if we don't also decarbonize the global economy, if we don't also find ways to transition to clean energy. So I feel like it's not or, it's and.
Yeah. And Lisa, from your standpoint, I mean, you're not a policy person, but you're a practice person.
Oh, my answer is going to be probably pretty radical, but when we went and spoke to the elders, they said, we asked them to help us. We were actually talking to them about helping with genetic modification, and they said, well, if you're willing to rid yourselves of negativity and blame, then that can be the place that you start from. And I was like, what does that have to do with anything? We got stuff we're going to do. And it was like, no, it was this self-responsibility. They're like, it's not the other person that needs to change. It's like what inside of yourself every single day, every action, every word, every thought, every single thing that you do comes from this place of self-responsibility. And that was the place that I think is a place that I can start from.
And Jeff, for you.
Yeah. So I think you have to work at all levels and you have to orient them towards a similar goal. And so what I mean by that is that, it's, pretty well established that voters don't reward preparedness, but they reward recovery. Right. One study I've seen, every $27,000 of recovery money that comes in buys an elected official a new vote. But there's no question of why are we spending so much on recovery? Why aren't we spending more on preparedness? There's no change in voter behavior for that. But at the same time, so there's a tremendous amount of power, but that power is incentivized by individual actions. And I also think too that, it's also important. So with the issue of climate change, like I think that the fight against the legitimacy of climate science actually has nothing to do with the science and whether or not people believe the science. And I have no data to support what I'm about to say. But I think that what it actually is it's about emissions control, and it's about doing business in a global competitive environment. And if it's a handicap to do business by being a good steward of the environment, you have no business incentive to do it. And you may actually end up out of business. And the plant workers who are having reduced hours and losing their pensions and all kinds of things. So a lot of this is being driven by things other than what we want them to be driven by. But I think it's important that we try to recognize at the community and at the household level, what are those drivers of decision making? What are those drivers of what makes for a sustainable home in addition to a sustainable environment, and make sure that we're providing solutions that speak to the larger picture, but also can improve the livelihoods of those at the individual and community levels.
That issue that you raised about voters rewarding recovery, not preparedness, has come up in my life as a journalist so many times that I ended up, it's not really a meme, and it wasn't really me that did this. A reader on .earth, my blog, a German guy in 2008 posted a comment saying, "Are we stuck with blah, 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 bang?" And this is like, if I created a hashtag out of it, this is a shortcut. If you just search for blah, 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 bang, listeners, you'll see. In the context of the tsunami in Japan, where villages had stones that were installed centuries ago that said, "Remember the great waves of the past. Don't build below this stone." And I wrote about that in the context of Fukushima, the horrible tsunami. And a new reader posted, "Well, if we can't get it right with tsunamis, they're inevitable. How can we get it right with global warming?" And I, some of that does feel, I don't want to leave us here in a state of sadness about this, but it does mean there's still a great frontier here, even now, with approaching these grand issues in ways that can maybe make a difference. And so I think it's great that you have a book coming out. I think it's great that Meehan is focusing her writing, in these arenas that are so challenging. And I think, Lisa, your skills and the reverberations around the way you approach your work and your life have applicability in all of these arenas. The more conversations like this we have, the better off the world will be. I wish there was 1,000 iterations of this sustain what module that we're kind of building here, and that it can spill into our learning at Columbia more than it has so far. We're trying to build a network just across the campus, a network of people in the arts and sciences and all the other disciplines, and engineering, philosophy, Corinna Gore's Earth Ethics Center. Most of these places don't talk to each other. And I think that too can be a big pathway forward. Having yoga masters talk to science writers and resilience professionals feels like a good start to me. I'm going to end with one thing to ask you all. And Jeremy Zalar, who used to work with me at the New York Times, and that he's just finishing 4 years of working on government websites so that they serve the public better. He lives in Brooklyn, and he was on the first one of these 2 weeks ago on Sunday. And he said, make sure, one thing that everyone should think about is what they can do tomorrow, or at least next week, that would tweak some needle here that they care about 5%. Like, what's the thing you personally, he always says, it has to be the personal thing that person can do that can take this in a slightly different direction. And I don't expect you to have to answer that question right now, but if you have an answer, that's great. But just to think about that, like what about my tweeting or my writing or my practice or my teaching, or can move something a few degrees. So I just want to give the floor to you all to kind of close things out with next steps, whether that you can answer that specific one or not.
I'll give a brief pontification, but I think back when I first started in this field, I was an intern in an urban area after 9/11. And there was a large national security event occurring, and it was one of the first post 9/11. And there were all these command centers set up all around the region. And I don't know the exact number. I'm going to say 50 because that's what I remember, but that might be a made up memory. And that in the exercises leading up to it, the one finding that everyone had was that there were too many coordination centers. They couldn't staff them all. It was too noisy. There were way too many. And on the day of the event, there were 50 command centers, coordination centers. Everybody agreed there were too many. No one was willing to give theirs up. No one saw theirs as unnecessary. So I guess what I would say with this is we're very good. And believe me, my coming from where I'm sitting, I'm the worst position to be lecturing on this because we're sometimes the worst in academia, is that we're very willing to tell other people how they should change, but we're very, very uncomfortable listening to ideas that are contrary to our gut and sort of the way we've been trained to receive and process and understand the world. And I think it's really important, like you said, take 5 minutes a day to try to listen to a perspective you don't agree with and try to understand on what common ground that perspective is coming from, because it just may be the idea that we need to carry things to the place we want to take them to. So,
a good one.
I could say something. I just want to say, first of all, thank you, Andy, for what you're putting together here. But there's made me think of this story of the 5 blind men with the elephant. Do you guys know the story? Yeah, right. And so it's like, no, it's the trunk is like this and the ear is like it. And that's what I feel like this moment is all about, is this opportunity for us to listen to each other, to hear exactly what you would prefer to go, no, this has no validity. Because here we are as a global entity, all dealing with this particular illness. And how can we all come together with, maybe who you wouldn't really listen to, maybe it is the native elders, maybe it is the yogis, maybe it is the scientists, maybe it is the political, maybe, the economic. We have to all hear each other's perspective on this. And I feel like if we can all do that, exactly just mimicking what you said, I feel like we can come up with a solution. And that's what, if I was in charge, I'd want everybody to start doing, is how do we listen to each other and find that oneness?
I would just briefly add to that I am really grateful to hear both of your perspectives today. It's really lovely to be in conversation with people who are experts or have knowledge bases that are not the same as mine and who are looking at this in very different ways. So thank you for that. And thank you, Andy, for organizing this. And I think in terms of action, that what you can do, I think that for me, it has come down to what am I good at? And how can I use those skills and apply them to this thing that seems to need help? I'm not a political organizer. I think political organizing is necessary and great. I'm not a disaster relief expert. I am not a yogi. I'm not going to do a good job of any of those things. The thing I happen to be good at is writing. So how can I train that at this problem? And so I don't know, for viewers, maybe instead of thinking about how can I be different so that I can be engaging with this problem more effectively, maybe thinking about what is it that I am really, really good at and how can I train that skill and apply that knowledge to this problem.
That's pretty great. And a lot of that's about reaching out and connecting. There's Seamus Khan, who's the chairman of Columbia's sociology department, last week on his own sprinted to create an online resource. It's called youthremote-learning.com. And it's taking his skills in teaching and learning and creating a place for dozens of people to volunteer to teach classes for kids who are homebound right now. And he's teaching a course in how to be an ethnographer, how as a kid to go out into this changing world and record it in ways that historians later can draw on. Oh, what fantastic. And tomorrow, Brighton Kaoma, who's a Zambian graduate student in the School of International Professional Affairs here, who's the intern for this initiative of mine. He's running an online workshop for how to be a radio reporter, because when he was 14 in Zambia, he was doing environmental radio reporting at the age of 14. And he's now working with people at the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia, Radhika Iyengar and others, to build this online space that they hadn't thought of just a few days ago. So I think, you multiply that by even 2 billion, just a few percent, a small chunk of the world, and you can really go a long way. So thank you all for contributing today to this discussion. And if you're willing, we can tune in again. This is not a quick turnaround. We're not putting out this fire in a hurry. The more we can build this conversation going forward and sustain connections with communities that matter, the more we will, I think, feel like we've done as much as we can. And that's kind of my goal too. So thank you again. Here's Liz Cody, who lives 3 houses from me, but who I can't meet with. Thanks for doing this, Andy, Jeff, Meehan, and Lisa. So I echo that. Thanks for doing this. And let's do it again. Thank you again. Have a great weekend.
Thank you so much.
Get some sunshine.
Meet all of you too.
Bye.
Great. Bye-bye.
Take care.